listening to United and Resilient, a podcast designed to help heal and support the El Paso community. Hello, I'm your host, Mariana Sierra, Outreach Coordinator for the El Paso United Family Resiliency Center, a program of United Way of El Paso County. We are dedicated to serve those who were impacted directly or indirectly by August 3rd. Join us on the journey to long-term recovery as we have honest conversations with local leaders, mental health specialists, and fellow El Pasoans who share their stories and expertise. We feature topics that influence and impact the vitality and resilience of our community. We are El Paso United, and together we heal. Juntos sanamos. Dear listener, before we begin, a note of warning. The topic we're about to explore contains a mention of the mass casualty event and a description of the events that unfolded thereafter. This episode may not be suitable for everyone. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of United and Resilient. Thank you so much for being here today. At the FRC, we recognize the importance of setting the standards now to prepare for possible future disasters. As part of our long-term goals, the FRC works towards creating partnerships and sharing experiences that can build capacity in other communities responding to a similar situation. In this episode, we'll have a very honest conversation with Ryan Logan, Director for Recovery Services at the American Red Cross. We'll discuss lessons learned from our border region and how we can find healing by providing support and guidance to other communities. Ryan, we're super excited to have you as a guest today. Welcome to United and Resilient.
Thank you. I'm glad to join and look forward to talking with you all.
Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background and experience and specialties, and what is it that you do for the American Red Cross?
Sure. So I'm the Director of Recovery Services for the American Red Cross, kind of at our national headquarters level. So my primary role is working with a team that manages really all of our financial assistance programs that we provide to individuals impacted by disasters, whether it be the single-family fires that we respond to, 65,000 times a year, or the larger scale disasters, the hurricanes, the wildfires, and then also to really just any other disaster that impacts the community, such as, a mass casualty event, a shooting event, a plane crash, things of that nature. I've been with the organization for 15 years and really have had the opportunity to respond to numerous disasters, large and small. Here since 2016, primarily have spent a lot of time supporting communities that have been impacted by, mass casualty shooting type events such as El Paso. I first started with the Pulse shooting in Orlando, and then also with the shooting in Las Vegas, Parkland, and again, most recently working with your great community after their tragedy on August 3rd.
Great. Thank you so much. And yes, I was when we first initially met, I was very intrigued on all the insight that you had when August 3rd happened here in our community. So can you briefly explain the role that American Red Cross had specifically regarding to our community and the role that you had during this day?
Sure. So, the Red Cross, we have the unique responsibility that when the National Transportation Safety Board created the aviation incident legislation in 1996 that really mandated how they would respond, as well as how the airlines and other transportation organizations would respond to sort of, plane crashes, large bus crashes, train accidents, that sort of thing. One of the things that was a part of that legislation was that the American Red Cross would serve as the primary organization responsible for family assistance centers following an event of that nature. And so since 1996, the Red Cross has really played a critical role in responding to that and really developed really a lot of subject matter expertise around how to assist communities impacted by those types of events, specifically around the Family Assistance Center. So really how to ensure that we were providing assistance to those, who had lost loved ones, who had loved ones that were injured from some sort of event like that, how to work with other partners, really take care of holistically the needs of those individuals. And so, that really became the basis for how we now respond to, sadly, what is, somewhat of a growing epidemic in this country with the mass shootings. And so really we just slightly tailored kind of what our normal response would be for an aviation incident, for example, how we could kind of use that experience that we had and really tending to those families to also come into communities and help them assist families impacted by, an event such as a shooting. And so sadly, we've got probably outside of maybe some law enforcement such as the FBI or even the NTSB, probably the most experience in dealing with mass casualty events, and really how we can come into a community and really provide, again, that holistic wraparound support to those individuals impacted either directly or the community at large impacted indirectly. And so, for these mass shooting type events, one of the primary things that we're focused on is really making sure that the families of the victims, whether again deceased or injured, really have access to the necessary services that they need to begin to start to move forward in what will be their new normal, right? So, providing them with access to, crime compensation, providing them access to mental health, spiritual care, also access to any sort of potential funding that they may not have access to as it results to any injuries. Because again, if you're, in an area where you may be, your insurance doesn't cover you because you're out of a state boundary, right? So, you were injured in an event and you're getting discharged from the hospital and you need some sort of adaptive technology, whether that be like a wheelchair, a walker, or even just need prescription medications. If you don't have the access to funds to just pay for that, again, that's kind of where we step in and we can provide some of that assistance. But again, also too, just kind of the Red Cross has a large network of partners, whether they be at the community level, the corporate level, that we really also tap into those networks to, again, look holistically at what are the needs of the individuals impacted by the event and what partners can we bring to bear to ensure that, even again, that those individuals really can take those next steps, whether it be some of our partners with travel or hospitality, right? So if individuals need assistance in, flying from one part of the country or even one part of the world to where the event occurred, we have a large network that we can tap into to bring those resources to bear so that we're able to get those family members brought to the location so that they can reunite or to handle the business, if they've had someone that's been deceased. So really, we look at it kind of as a holistic approach to how can we really start to identify what are the needs of the individuals that were directly impacted as well as indirectly impacted. But then another big part of that is also looking at how can we really work with the community to also focus on their community resilience, thinking about, what's next. Because again, as we've seen, and hopefully in most of these communities, a mass casualty incident is a one-time event, right? And so, for most cities, this is their first rodeo with any of this. And so, as with anything, if it's your first time, you really don't know what to expect other than what's right in front of you at the time. And so we're able to bring in the resources to really not only think about, okay, how do you handle what's right now, but also to begin to think about, what's next, and, start to begin thinking 5 steps ahead. So that, again, there's really no lapse in assistance to the individuals, but also to the community at large.
Right. And Ryan, one of the things that that I really liked in our previous discussion is that you were impacted by our community response and how our community, basically responded to August 3rd. So I wanted to ask you, what were some of the things that impacted you, if you can share with our audience?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the primary things was the fact that El Paso had already begun to think about resiliency and community resiliency, right? You're one of the few cities in the country that actually has a standalone community resiliency officer for the county. And so, knowing that there is this deliberate, intentional focus on, how do you, as a community, how do we think about becoming more resilient? And, initially, I don't believe that position was thinking about resiliency in the same light that we're talking about it today. They were thinking more about, how do you build, community infrastructure that makes a more resilient community? How do we make sure that we're able to still operate and grow and continue to thrive as a community when something happens, whether it be, Mother Nature, whether it just be some sort of, economic issue. You guys have been on the front lines for several years now of very unique situations that the majority of the country has no experience with, whether it be issues on the border, right, which really create a really unique circumstance for you all. But again, thinking about as a community, how do y'all become more resilient when you're faced with those issues? Again, you guys have been on the front lines, unfortunately, with the COVID epidemic. And so, how do you think about, knowing that you guys are El Paso, just the way you are geographically, you're very much kind of like an island into yourselves, right? The closest large community is literally 6 hours away. And so, how do you focus on taking care of yourselves and your community when you know that the resources aren't going to be able to get to you necessarily in a matter of minutes, right? So I think that really struck me in the fact that you guys were already, as a community, really being progressive in your thought about, how do we, with whatever situation may present itself in this community, how do we think about making El Paso just more resilient so that when stuff does happen, we're able to keep moving, keep growing, keep thriving? I think the second thing that really struck me is, again, really just the unique nature and the strong level of community engagement and just literally just the strong community that you guys have. I've seen it in several places around the country, but you guys just had a really strong sense of community where, folks really stepped up, really were focused on how to take care of each other. Folks that had never met before or really had never been engaged before, but really were willing to just kind of step up and fill the needs of others. And to me, I think that speaks volumes to kind of the leadership of your community and really just the tone and tenor that has, where, it really is about neighbor helping neighbor. And I think a lot of that may be, again, as the result of kind of just your geographic isolation to some degree, is you've always kind of learned to be self-reliant and really lean on one another. And I think, if there is a silver lining to these types of events, I think that's some of the stuff that really shows itself is you really do see the best of humanity when things like this happen. And I think, seeing your community step up, but also not just your own community, but again, just this whole bilateral, national, geographic connection that you guys have with like your neighbors across the border, right? How it really isn't just, U.S. centric, but you guys really do depend on your neighbors across the border and vice versa. And so it just really creates this really unique dynamic that I've never seen, but it was really awesome to see just how close of a tie there was between the two. And really folks didn't see themselves as, I'm from the United States or I'm from Mexico. Like it was just, everybody was individuals. And I think that sort of spirit is really, really cool. So I think, a couple of those two things struck me, but I also feel like, you guys have really strong leadership. And I think that was one of the things that also really resonated was there were strong folks in positions who were really thinking 2 steps ahead, but also were thinking with true compassion.
Right.
And really, it wasn't about just thinking about the now, but really, how can we parlay this into something more? Which is something that I find really remarkable. Again, hats off to your leaders, both at the community level as well as those kind of elected or those informal community leaders, right? It was really just, to me, really cool to see when we had that first meeting of community organizations about, what's next, just the level of engagement, the lack of ego, which can tend to find itself in any situation. None of that was in place. It was all about how do we take care of the people that have been impacted? And then also, how do we take care of our community? And how do we do it in a way that just doesn't happen right this minute, but let's do it not fast, but let's do it right. And I think that really spoke to me, again, just about the level of dedication that folks have in that community about really looking out for each other and really wanting to make the best impact on folks' lives.
Right. I think one of the biggest things, and I agree with you, that I saw, it was not about, oh, my name is on it or my organization is on it. It was really about the people and what we represent. And I love that you share that with our audience, because I really want people to feel proud of that uniqueness that El Paso and Ciudad Juarez is. We really are sister cities. And I think, and I always like to say from people who are outside this border is, you know what, I can explain to you that you can be in 5 minutes, you can be in another country, and then you can be back to another country in another 5. But I can explain that so many times, but you really understand what we're all about once you step inside. Once you're here, once you see our people, what we're all about. And I think it's really important for people, for our community members to recognize that, to feel proud about that, this was something that happened to us, right? And it was very unfortunate and we're healing together, but it definitely doesn't represent us. What represents us is what you saw that day and that unity and that collaboration. And I love that. Thank you for sharing that with us. And, one of the things that I really wanted to discuss with you, and I mentioned this right now, is about community resilience. I don't know if I'm the only one, but, since the pandemic, I've seen this word around in social media and in ads and, everywhere. And I'm like, well, okay, so I'm so intrigued by what is community resilience. So I want to ask you, Ryan, to you, what is community resilience? How would you define this term?
Yeah, I like you. It's become quite the buzzword of late. And for me, I really see community resilience really simply is how do we continue to move forward, thrive, and grow, even when we have some large hurdles that we weren't really prepared for fall into that path. It's, in the business sector, they look at it as, business continuity, right? So prime example, how do we in this pandemic, how do businesses continue to move forward when, all of their workforce is used to working together in an office setting or in a warehouse or whatever? How do we continue to make our business work when we can't do that? I see that same sort of thing with community resilience. It's really about, how do we focus on the people, the industry, everything that really makes up a community? How do we continue to go on, right? And not just traditionally just go on, but ideally you want to go on better, right? You want to really come out of this for the better, right? And so, I look at community resiliency, especially on kind of the disaster side. We look at this, really focused on how do we take care of the folks psychologically, which is critical, especially to events like this, right?
Right.
Folks it's really interesting just, when certain people get impacted by these events, right? It could be, obviously there's people that are literally impacted at the moment, people that lose loved ones or have folks that are injured as a result of something like that. They literally feel that psychological impact immediately. Then there are other folks that, are in the community that weren't there, but they start to feel something manifest because they feel like their community was attacked, right? And so that may manifest, days, weeks, months, years later. It's really focusing on, again, like how do you take whatever event or issue that's kind of presented itself to you, how do you push through that? How do you adapt? And really, how do you embrace what really might be your new normal? And I know that's another term that's thrown around, but I think that's the thing that is really important is that, events change how people and communities react to moving forward. If we take the example of the pandemic, right? Like, I think we're never going to go back to the way life was before. I think as a country, we'll adapt a new normal. Face masks may be something that's a part of our new normal moving forward, right? And, you'll see businesses and industries really realize, well, hey, I might not need to bring everybody into an office setting every day because we've learned that people can work remotely, right? And I think there's things that shape the future of communities. And I think that whole resiliency piece is really, how do you take what's happened and how do you think about how you as a community take that and really do move forward in a positive way where the community can thrive, where folks are able to, again, be a little bit stronger, because the next time something happens, you're going to be a little bit more prepared for it. Kind of using the example of the psychological impacts, right? One of the things that we teach in communities across the country is psychological first aid. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that we just offer when a disaster happens. It's something that we offer in communities during, sunshiny skies. And because what we want folks to do is really know how to kind of take care of themselves when something does happen. Because, in most communities, especially on natural disasters, it's not a matter of like if, but when you're going to be impacted by something. And so, knowing what the impacts of that disaster may be on you, but then also understanding how to cope with that, how to recognize the signs of it in yourself or your family members or your children, really to develop kind of those skills necessary so when something does happen, it doesn't have quite the impact that it may in a negative way. And so I think that, again, to me, is all part of that community resiliency. It's really, how do we really start to provide the resources and access to certain services or whatever that may be. So when something does happen, yeah, it's going to be somewhat of a setback or a hurdle, but we're going to be able to move through it and we're going to come out better on the other side for it.
Right. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Ryan, is that, our community is so unique in the fact that we have gone through, quite the scenarios. First, we have, this community where, it's an immigrant community, and we had that immigrant influx. And then we had August 3rd, and then we had the pandemic. And it was one of the, hot spots at some point. Mm-hmm. So it feels like, I know a lot of community members are feeling like it's one thing after another thing after another thing. So I wonder, to your perspective, how can us as El Pasoans, as Juarenses, how can we build resilience, even though, all of these things are happening, and it feels that we cannot heal properly from one thing and then another thing happens?
And I think it's, I hate to sound probably like a little bit of a negative Nancy here, but I think, unfortunately, I think that's going to be, and I use the phrase new normal, I think communities are going to really start to see and feel that, right? I think, I was talking to a colleague just last week from Louisiana, right? And this past year, they were hit with one hurricane after another hurricane after another hurricane, right? So as soon as you got the shingles on the first storm replaced, another one came along and blew them all off, right? And so it's tough. But I don't sadly see that changing too much, especially as it results to, kind of the Mother Nature stuff. And, the pandemic stuff, it's scary, right? We don't know what the next thing holds. But I think the biggest piece for me is around really, how do you build a strong network within your community that actually focuses on the people, right? So I think, one, it's knowing what are the resources that are available to you in your community. Also, having those community resources, really being nimble and flexible. Because I think that's one of the things that, we talked about a little bit before, when we had that first meeting of community organizations to really think about the next steps for El Paso after the shooting, it wasn't about, well, my agency only does A, B, and C, right? And that's all we can do. It was, what are the needs, and how can my agency basically shift its focus, expand its mission, really do what needs to be done in order to take care of the people. And I think that, to me, is really one of the most important pieces of community resiliency is, one, kind of doing that threat assessment, if you will, and that seems to be kind of like a really strong word, but really thinking about, we see this in emergency management all the time, right? I'm sure Chief Rodriguez on a notebook in his office has literally a list of, here are the 10 most likely bad things that are going to happen in El Paso that we need to plan for, right? And there's those 10, but then I'm sure he probably didn't have a pandemic on that list. Probably didn't really have an event like August 3rd on that list, right? Like, he knows that y'all have flooding. He knows that y'all have, weather, whatever. But it's really kind of identifying what are all these possible things that can happen. And as a result of that, what are some of the issues that we think will arise for our community as a result of that? And then how can we start to identify the best ways to meet those needs when they do happen? And again, I think a lot of that really comes down to, one, again, knowing what resources you have in your backyard, knowing the people in your community and really what their needs are on a regular day, right? In most communities, we know people are basically living paycheck to paycheck, right? And so it's not like folks have a lot of expendable income. Research shows that most folks don't have an additional $400 in their account to pay for something if something unexpectedly happens, right? So like fiscal resources is always going to be something that you may need. And so really starting to think through, what are those potential scenarios that may present themselves in our community, and who might be the best folks to really step up and to assist. But also, again, thinking holistically, what other impacts? I think we can think about the tangible stuff. We can think about, how you repair infrastructure, how you rebuild homes, but it's that internal psychological piece, the toll that has on individuals. And I think that's what we're seeing across the board, across the country right now is, just the impact that these events have on people. The more and more they go through it, you can get a little bit more accustomed to it, and you you can kind of navigate it. But then at some point you hit a wall, right? Yeah. And what are the resources that we have available to those folks? How do we expand the mental health capability in a community to really make sure that people are recognizing the signs in themselves that they're, potentially going into some level of depression, right? They haven't been able to leave their homes for almost a year, haven't been able to see their grandmother in a year. They've had family members that have died alone, right? Because they couldn't be by their side during COVID. So all of that does take a true impact on a person. And I think it's, how do we bring the resources to bear to those individuals that may not even know that they need it? But, we know, the community knows that they're starting to see where folks need these things. And we as a community need to bring that to bear. Because I think, one of the things that we've learned, obviously through, especially kind of around the mass casualty type event, is that, a lot of times people don't know what they don't know. Mm-hmm. They don't know that potentially in a couple of weeks or in a couple of months or in a couple of years, some of these issues may manifest themselves, right? So it's about that public education awareness, really making the services available to folks, even though they may not know they need it now, getting it out there to them. So when it does manifest, they've already got the tools on how to equip themselves and how to deal with it is really important. And so I think for me, it's really just really thinking about what is the nature, what is that sense that you're getting from the community? And really starting to identify, here are some of the trends that we're seeing. And, how can we start to bring resources to bear? Again, people may not be presenting and stepping up and saying, hey, I need X. Right. But again, if you proactively bring that resource to bear and let folks know that resource is there, I think you'll be surprised at the number of people that really start to raise their hand and say, hey, I do need that. I didn't realize I needed it, but I really do need it. And it's great to know that's there. And so I think for me, that's really kind of how we look at working with communities to kind of build that resiliency framework to some degree.
Right. And that's one of the main reasons we have this podcast, right? Because we want to provide the education, the awareness, the tools that maybe someone out there listening is, you know what, maybe counseling right now is not for me. Maybe non-traditional therapy is not for me right now, but at least they're aware that these resources are available for them and that we are here healing together as a community. This is United and Resilient. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Fabiola Echoberry. I'm a licensed professional counselor and also president of Trauma and Resilience in the Berlin Institute. And I was also part of the August 3rd. I happened to be sitting in the Corner Bakery planning a meeting that I was going to set because I want to become a network that if anything happened in El Paso, we would be ready as counselors or professionals, ready to do these wonderful protocols that we have to assist with something traumatic. But as I'm sitting there and I hear word of, the shooting, this came sooner than later. I was hoping we would never have to use these protocols here in El Paso, but I'm very pleased that at least we at this point were ready to go. And I was part of, I went home, a colleague called me and said, hey, Fabi, she works for the Emergency Health Network, and she's part of the crisis intervention team that rides with police officers. So they were on scene quickly. She called me, my counselors are going to be burned out really quick. So I need you, is there any way that you can put out that, anybody who wants to help out this week will join us tomorrow at 10 o'clock at the local mental health authority. So I put that email out to everybody. We had 61 colleagues show up. So I'm really proud that we had 61 of our colleagues, even as far as Las Cruces, show up. And we were able to assist that week and many weeks following pro bono, doing groups and classes and I took on clients here at my private practice and worked at Emergency Health Network. So we were able to help out and we were happy to help out. Also, 2 weeks later, we were able to get help from Dr. Ignacio Jaredo, a psychologist from Mexico, on these protocols that help for acute stress stabilization for something that might have just happened. So we were able to do 3 days of groups all day. People just walked in, were able to process the event, come back if they wanted to the next day. And we did that for 3 days. And it was really helpful. We had from firemen, we had some people that were there. So they were able to come, even some people came as far as Juarez to those groups. So we were happy that we were able to provide this. And then we did another follow-up groups on 3 months after. So that was great that we were able to assist the community. Also, I'm happy that because of what my organization's been doing the last 3 years in preparing and making this a more trauma-informed care community, we were able to train therapists. And at this point, we have over 200 therapists that are trained in what's called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, which is therapy. It's not so much talk. It's more using bilateral stimulation to help the brain finish processing the disturbance and the events. When something happens, it gets tied with what we see, what we hear, smell, all the senses, negative cognition, and that's how it gets stored. EMDR helps to bring up that memory, help digest the disturbance, and give it and reframe it to a new meaning. So it's more adaptive. So we were pleased that we can provide this here, and there's still a lot of colleagues that are providing therapy in EMDR. So this is something that I really am glad that we were able to bring to our community, because with this therapy, we were able to be prepared for something like this and ready for it. I'm glad that we had that at that point. So in a roundabout way, I say we were preparing for this in the last 3 years, and we had the capability of helping our community. So I really encourage people that if keep going to therapy if you're in therapy. If you're not in therapy, you might want to consider going to therapy, but try to look up somebody that has an evidence-based for trauma. And EMDR is one of those that I encourage people to seek. Another thing that I also encourage people, if you're already in therapy, maybe also adding some mindfulness-based stress reduction course And right now they're doing it online, and it's a lot of yoga and, just breathing. It's just wonderful to be very in the here and now, because with trauma, we tend to go to the past and we tend to go to the future, and we just need to be in the present most of the time. And that's a wonderful way to be very aware of your body and what you're feeling and thinking without judging, just bringing yourself gently back to the here and now, and all these wonderful techniques that mindfulness class can help you. So those are just some things. Other things that we know that can help is, other things that you enjoy. You need to do a lot of self-care. This is a time to do a lot of self-care and just not judging. We live so, of things that we feel that we should be doing and we must be doing. The only thing we got to do is breathe and stay in the moment and just be kind to ourselves. That's the only thing I'm going to say. We got to remember to be kind to ourselves, especially when you've been through something so traumatic. It's normal to be very judgmental and harsh, and you have all this negative shoulda, woulda, coulda thinking. And so we just got to learn that, no, I did the best I could with the bad situation I was in, or what the experiences that I've had. So all the things that you're feeling and all the things that you're noticing, that's normal for the bad thing that you've been through, or bad things that you've been through. So just be kind to yourself, and no judgment, just observe and just be kind to yourself.
One of the things that I also wanted to ask you, Ryan, one of the things that we think about as the FRC, as the Family Resiliency Center, is how can we share our knowledge to other communities? How can we help other communities build resilience? For example, communities like El Paso, Las Vegas, Orlando, that are fortunately went to something similar. How can we provide the frameworks now for obviously unwanted but possible future disasters? How can we all collaborate together?
So I think it's easy, but it's tough. And this is where I'm going with that. So, you would think that most communities, having kind of seen the rise of these types of events, over the past, 10 or so years, would really make planning for such an event priority in their community. And I think we've seen that. We've seen tons of planning as it relates to the law enforcement, emergency management, EMS, hospitals, all of that have really done a really great job at thinking about, when something like this happens, how they're going to respond, right? How they're going to neutralize the threat, how they're going to handle the immediate, how they're going to, handle the surge in the hospital. But that's where the planning has stopped. And I think where communities like yourselves and those that have been impacted by these events really can really help out and share their knowledge and expertise is really, start in those immediate communities where you have the most impact, and really say, hey, look, you guys have done a great job of planning for, an active shooter in X community, but have you thought about the hard part, the next step, right? The taking care of the people, the taking care of the community, all of that stuff that really no planning really takes place. I think we did see right after El Paso where, there was the shooting up in the Odessa area where, you guys did reach out and say, hey, we just went through this a few weeks ago. We're here to support and help you. Right. Now, whether or not communities are willing to accept that, that's on them. But I think it's really about documenting what you guys have done and learned. And then, reaching out to those communities when it does happen. I think that's one of the things that we've seen, after the Pulse shooting, when we had the event in Las Vegas,
Mm-hmm.
You know, a team that I worked with from the city of Orlando actually came to Vegas to help provide them with their experience, right? And I've seen that kind of trickle to other events where, you know, in El Paso, we had folks from these sister communities. Y'all had the folks from Las Vegas come and provide support. So I think, you know, you sadly have joined kind of this alumni, if you will, that, you know, is able to provide that information when it happens. I think that's the easy part. I think the hard part is getting folks to take the actions now in their communities to plan for it. And like I said, you know, I've been in meetings, you know, we hosted the Super Bowl in Atlanta a couple of years ago. And I remember going to those planning meetings and it was all about, you know, if something happens at the stadium, what they're going to do, how they're going to handle it. And I kept raising my hand and saying, okay, that's great. Then what? Right? You know, like what are we thinking about what's next? You know, what are we thinking about a family assistance center? What are we thinking about, you know, who's going to take the lead on, you know, mental health in the community and on and on and on and on. And that's where the folks didn't have the answers. And that's the tough part because it's really dealing with the people and, again, that holistic approach to the folks. And so, you know, I think, you know, one of the things that I was fortunate enough to attend with, you know, Rodriguez with your emergency management and fire department last year, the Federal Emergency Management Agency pulled together a group of stakeholders really to kind of have this type of a conversation is how do we, as, you know, a country, how do we really start to help communities plan for these types of events? And what does that look like? And so, you know, just getting some initial stakeholders around the table for the first time ever to start to have that conversation, I think is a step in the right direction. You know, I know for me and for my organization, you know, we're constantly kind of throwing this in folks' face that, again, it's not enough to just stop at, you know, once the thing goes boom, how you handle it. But again, what's next? What does that recovery look like? You know, and I think that's the challenging part is getting folks to realize that, you know, it's again, not a matter of if, but a matter of when for many, many communities across the country. And I think what you guys are doing is leaps and bounds ahead of other communities, right? I mean, just your podcast alone and really trying to do the public outreach to folks, I think is a huge start. I think, you know, it really is just going to take us kind of knocking on a lot of doors and continuing to raise the issue to get communities to see that this is really, really important. And, you know, if you are able to, God forbid, have something like this happen in your community, if you have somewhat of a semblance of a plan, it makes those first 48, 72 weeks after an event, it makes such a big difference just because it does take a lot of some of that initial pressure off of folks about what they need to do, right? It provides that initial direction. And I think it's also great for, you know, engaging those community organizations, right? Like when we talk about community resiliency as a whole, like I mentioned before, you know, one of the things that's really important is just knowing who's doing what in your community on a daily basis, right? And when something happens, how can you possibly go to them and say, all right, we got this issue. Is there something y'all can do to help us navigate through this, right? And a lot of times in communities, especially in government, you know, we kind of get a little bit myopic in kind of how we look at things. Sometimes government folks don't really know what a lot of their nonprofit community is doing there, right? And what resources they really have to bring to bear. And it requires just bringing them to the table to have that conversation. And so, you know, for me, I think, you know, having the ability to reach out through your network, right? You know, everybody kind of has some sort of level of hierarchy, right? You guys are very close partners with United Way.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are United Ways all across this country, right? So your United Way leadership has a great platform to go to their United Way colleagues around the country to say, hey guys, let's talk to you all about what we've learned and what we would share with y'all as to when something happens in your community. Here's some of the things that y'all need to initially just start out with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Y'all have done a lot of great work with the foundation. So again, all those foundations talk to one another. They have a network. So using that network to say, okay, well, Community Foundation X, we're going to bring host conference calls, Zoom, webinar, whatever. Let's talk to all these other community foundations across the country about what we learned going through this and what they need to be potentially anticipating if something like this were to happen in their community, right? Emergency management is doing that. I know I've been present at several presentations that, Chief Rodriguez has done, highlighting lessons learned and what the emergency management community can do better and really learn from. So I think it's really kind of utilizing all the networks that we kind of have, our spheres of influence, and really just trying to grow it that way. I think it's going to be the most probably impactful way to actually see really kind of the message get promulgated out there to other communities. But, I'm always a fan if there's any opportunity, conventions, conferences, whatever you can do to get yourself on the agenda to talk about things.
Yeah.
I'm always about it. So.
Yeah. And I would add, Ryan, I think one of the things that really impacted me as I came into this role at the FRC was those meetings that we had with community members where we just had an honest conversation with them and listen to their needs and recognize the uniqueness of each individual in that meeting, sitting in that chair, the uniqueness of their needs and the diversity of the needs that there were. So I think that's one of my biggest takeaways as far as like how our community responded. And actually, you answered my next question about how nonprofit organizations can collaborate with each other. And but now I think one of the things that I've learned also is that there's healing in taking action as well. And I guess that's just how I work. I know it's not the case for everyone. Everyone heals in different ways. But for me is really taking action, right? So when this happened in my community, I wanted to help as much as possible. And I know there's some individuals out there that can identify with what I'm saying right now, that they want to take action. They want to heal by taking action. So what would you say to those community members that want to be involved, that maybe they're not part of a nonprofit organization, or they're just like, individuals in the community that want to be prepared, that want to be talking about community resilience? What would you say to those community members that want to promote community resilience from where they are right now?
So I think the first thing I would say is get involved now before something happens, right? So whether that, signing up to take a course in psychological first aid, or, identifying, a nonprofit that you connect with their mission, right? Like take the steps now. Don't necessarily wait for something to happen. But I do know that, oftentimes something does have to happen before folks kind of feel the need. So I think, I would just encourage folks, if you have kind of that something kind of in you right now that's like, I have an interest in this, but don't really know, take action on it now. Get involved, learn what you can. I think the second thing around taking action is, I know when something happens, that is the first initial impact everybody has is, I want to do something, but I would just encourage folks just to take a pause and find out really what's needed before taking action. Because one of the things that we see is all these folks with the best of intentions can oftentimes overwhelm the situation and kind of create a little second disaster within itself, right? I think about anytime there's a disaster, people feel the need to clean out their clothes and take it and donate it to all these people that have been impacted, right? Yeah. I have yet to work a disaster where, we just don't see a plethora of, I don't need a prom dress in the middle of a hurricane, right? Just take a beat, give folks a minute to really assess what's the need, and then help meet that need. And I think that's, again, people's just innate action is to, I'm going to do something, and I know people need paper towels, so I'm just going to take a ton of paper towels to X, right? Again, everybody has that same mentality. You're going to have more paper towels than you're ever going to need or use, right? So I think it's really thinking about, once something does happen, how to utilize that passion to get engaged in the right way. Again, we've seen when things like this, especially these mass casualty events happen, everybody that has any sort of credentialing around mental health or psychiatry, psychology, all of those folks step forward and say, I'm here, or they will inundate a reception center saying, I want to do something. And that's super appreciative. But at the same time, it's one, we have to vet all of you folks. Are all your certifications still valid? Are you trauma informed? It's very different, than someone that's just a psychiatrist. There's just right. So it's if you think you may have an interest in something happening, God forbid, in a community, kind of take the steps now. So when it does happen, you're already kind of associated with an organization that will step in and support that. Right. But I do think it's just really important that, when people do want to get involved, everything is, and I would never discourage anybody from stepping up to do anything. I would just really encourage folks to just take a beat, wait for the community, government, whomever, this kind of leading and running the response to say, hey, community, we have this need, right? And then when that need is presented, then if you feel like that's a need that you can meet, then you step up to support. Because what we don't want to do is just create or exacerbate an already bad situation with people wanting to do the best and wanting to really help, but really it hinder the operation. So I think for me, that would be the first thing. But I think, right now, I would just really encourage people to start getting engaged and volunteering where they can with an organization that really feels like it's something they connect with. Because as we've both alluded to, when we bring all those organizations together to say, okay, guys, how do we move forward as a community? All of those organizations, to some degree, are represented at that table. And again, that's going to be when it's okay, we're going to step up and support this. And that organization is going to go back to their volunteer base or those that support it and say, okay, here's what we've been asked to do. This is how we need for you to help, right? So I think that's really important. It's just engaging now, if you can. And then the other thing is, again, just think before folks decide to just donate stuff. Wait until they tell you what there's a need for, and then provide for that need. But, don't just use it as an opportunity to just take a lot of stuff that, again, may go unused or, may not be needed at the time.
Right. I love that. Thank you.
That's a hard one, because even for us at the Red Cross, we're, 97% of our workforce is volunteers across the country, right? The folks that were working at the Family Assistance Center in El Paso were volunteers from all over the country who had deployed there to support that incident. And so, that's why I just really do encourage folks to engage early, because for especially events like that, we don't use folks that we haven't really already vetted and really know who they are because of the sensitivities around that type of a response, right? Very different than, a community that's impacted by a hurricane and, we just need help handing out food. Completely different skill set needed, right? So, that's why as much as we encourage folks just to kind of get involved. So again, those organizations, one can vet the folks because again, you see a lot of folks come forward that mean well, but may not be the best suited to help with certain things. And so, allowing those organizations the time to kind of vet and really identify those folks is really important. So again, it's why I kind of just go back to engage now. Even if it's just, an hour to a month with an organization, right? I think one, in this current environment, I have seen, I know we have really adapted and we do so much volunteer opportunities now virtually. I've seen that really grow across the entire nonprofit sphere. So, even volunteering with organizations halfway across the country, right? Because of the way that everybody's working remotely, it allows a really unique opportunity. So I would just truly encourage folks now more than ever to really tap into that, because if you're tired of just sitting at home watching Netflix, take an hour or two and start to utilize some time or learn about something that really interests you. And when something does happen, you have the skill set, right? You have the end. So I think now presents a unique opportunity for folks to really tap into some volunteerism that they may not have had the time or the space for before. I think, if anything, COVID has given us just a little bit more space in our lives that we're not going at 100 miles an hour. Folks can actually focus on some of that stuff. So I would just encourage folks to really think about that and use what time they have now.
There's so much power in engagement. That's what I always tell my little sister. I always encourage her to be engaged, to be informed, because there's so much power and so much. I don't even have a word for it. Being engaged with a community is just something lovely that really gives you the perspective to so many things.
I think just that, I was going to say, just that connection to your community. I think that's so important. And I think you're 100% right. Like that level of engagement that you have with your community, it gives you just a little extra pep in your step. But also I think it allows for people to really see what life is like for others, right? Again, I think, we tend to be a very myopic society, right? I know what I know. I know what my life experience is. But it's kind of that opportunity to engage, to be with other organizations or to affiliate with other organizations or volunteer or work for, whatever it may be, that serve a demographic different than yours is such an eye-opening thing.
100%.
When you see that, there are people that live, that kids don't know when they're going to get their next meal, right?
Right.
So I think it also just does so much to just elevate your social conscience about what life is really like, really understanding that this world is a big world and there's a lot of different things and a lot of different thoughts and ways of life. And I'm with you. Like, I think that level of community engagement is huge. And I think it also just allows for you to have that much more pride in your community because you're seeing all these other great folks out there that are working tirelessly for pennies on the dollar for a lot of them to really meet the needs of all the folks out there in the community. So, I'm a huge proponent for community engagement. I've moved a lot through the course of my career. And I will tell you that probably some of the most unhappiest times that I've ever been when I was in the community is when I wasn't engaged, when I was just basically go to work, come home, had my little friends, but wasn't truly engaged in the community. But as soon as I started to do something, whether it was volunteer, get on a board, do whatever, and really start to feel like I was a part of that community, That's really when,
bigger.
Correct. Yeah. So completely agree 100% that engagement is so important.
Yes. I love this conversation, Ryan. I'm so sad that it's coming to an end. But my last question would be, and I always ask this question, what would be a message of hope that you would love to give to our community members?
I think my message of hope is really just continue to take it one day at a time, right? There's going to be good days. There's going to be bad days. Things are going to happen. You're going to feel setbacks, but tomorrow is always a new day. And, really just try to keep as much as you can focused on one foot in front of the other. But also, I think more importantly than that is know that you are not alone, right? Knowing that you have resources, knowing that there are people who want nothing more than to support those folks that need whatever support they need to get to that next step. And, it doesn't make you less than to ask for help. All you need to do is just say, hey, I need a little extra help today to get me through this. There will be a ton of people surround you to get you to the next step. So, I think that's really my message. And I think that's really just honestly how to live life, right? Is just focus on the next day, and knowing that, there are going to be setbacks and you don't have to feel good every day. It's okay. I think that's the other thing is really just when you have a bad day, it's okay to have a bad day, nothing wrong in that, but knowing that tomorrow is a new day, you have a great opportunity to make it what it is and really just keep focusing on what's next and just know that you're not alone and really, if you need it, pick up the phone, text, call, whatever you need to do. Resources are always there to support folks going through whatever they're going through.
100%. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. You have no idea how much I enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure folks out there listening did too. I cannot thank you enough for everything, all the help that you've given us. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you guys. I hate that, just the way that things have been over the past year that I haven't been able to be out there in person. I was really looking forward to being out there this past August and sharing the 1-year commemoration with you all. And, El Paso has a special place in my heart. And so anything I can continue to do to support you all and really just the community, I'm happy to do it. And hopefully soon I'll be actually able to see you all in person.
We hope so too. We really do. We also have a place for you in our hearts, Ryan. We really do. So again, thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening today. We hope this content serves you and your loved ones as well. If you enjoyed our podcast, please do not forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at El Paso United FRC to learn more about our commitment to the community's long-term recovery. Please join us on the next episode.